So I had a really good question at one of the tables that I thought I would answer. And the question was this. The question was, did we hear you right? Did you say that we can make a student who has a learning disability not have a learning disability? Right? And the answer to that is, what research has shown us is clear. If you start and you identify a child early who's on that pathway clearly to have a learning disability in reading, and you provide the right interventions in a timely manner at the right intensity, that typically what happens is we can take many of those children who would have gone on to be diagnosed with a learning disability without the intervention or the intervention at a certain level, they will not end up having a learning disability. So yes, the answer is we can technically do that. The other reason we know that that happens is because one of the great advantages of having all the medical technology we have now is if you assess and you put children into MRI machines and some of the brain mapping machines when they're 5 or 6 years old, and you look at how the ones who are having trouble reading with the phonetics, what tends to happen is the wrong area of the brains are lighting up. So that tells us that the areas where the processing should be happening for the average learner or the good reader is not happening. If you put them in intensive reading intervention and it's working, what happens is when you re-image them, all the areas of the brain that weren't working before that should have been, now are the right areas that are lighting up. So the intervention is actually rewiring the brain. Okay? So we know, not only do we know it works from a study it in terms of do they seem to come off that trajectory, but we actually have the brain behavior research that shows us that the areas of the brain actually seem to rewire based on the intervention, and that they no longer have the wrong areas of the brain lighting up. It goes to be the right areas of the brain. So yes, I did not misspeak. We can take a child who's on the trajectory and probably would have developed a learning disability and take them off that trajectory so they don't have a learning disability. Okay? So what I want to talk about now is called response to intervention. We've put the fancy name of response pedagogy, but it is AKA response to intervention. So what I'm going to try and do then today is kind of tell you what is RTI, what's the big deal, why should schools want to use this RTI framework, what are the essential elements of RTI, what's the purpose of assessment within RTI, and a very brief description of intervention in an RTI framework. Very, very brief. So the first question is, what's the big deal? Why should schools want to use this RTI framework? And the answer is, the answer is that we want to use it because ultimately we're going to show that it does improve the learning of all students. That's the ultimate reason. But basically, one of the first things you need to know is that RTI is not a special education initiative. And I think that sometimes when people originally heard about RTI, and because it had this assessment piece and this intervention piece, that they thought, you know what, RTI is about special ed. I'm not a special ed teacher, I'm a general ed teacher, so therefore I really don't need to know about RTI because RTI is special ed. RTI is not special ed. An RTI framework is a whole school framework. It's a whole school initiative, right? And it truly is owned cooperatively by everyone within the school. The regular education teacher, right? The special education teacher, the LST, the professionals that come into your building, the SLP, the psychologist, and technically the social worker could be part of an RTI process as well. An OT, a PT, all of those people could be part of an RTI framework. So really it is all about being able to support children by us all working together and being at whole school. It is consistent with other things that you've read. So for example, if you've ever had you've ever read the report of the expert panel on reading in Ontario that came out in 2003. Basically, it talks a lot about the idea of a very consistent focus on early identification and early intervention to support students, right? If you have trouble sleeping at night, I would recommend the 2003 report on the expert panel of reading in Ontario. The other thing is PPM 8, which was just released about a year and a half ago, which drives now from the ministry in terms of some of this intervention. PPM 8 really does focus on early assessment and early intervention. So it is in the documents that are coming out of the ministry. What I often like to focus on is the second point, though, that the framework of RTI, I don't think is exactly what you as good teachers do every single day. Right? Every good teacher uses assessment to understand their student, right? They differentiate the instruction when that student needs differentiated instruction. They provide this assistance to the students when they need the assistance, and you don't provide the assistance if they don't need the assistance at that time. And you use all of those things, and you have a decision-making process that you go through in terms of how you work with the kids using your data and how they're responding. I think it's just good teacher pedagogy that every single person does in this room on a day-out, day-out basis. So it's not different that way, even though we've given it this name now called response to intervention. And the other thing about response intervention is it does help us focus to ensure that we're focusing on the learning of all students. Okay, it's not a special ed intervention. We're going to focus on all students, and we're going to do it in a way, the framework allows us to do it in a more systematic way, where we're ensuring that we're analyzing and we're using data, and we're aligning that data and the response to what the kids need. Okay? So one of the presentations I went to a couple years ago with RTI, one of the things that one of the people generated this, and I think it's perfect. There is no way that a single teacher has all the time, all the knowledge, and all the skills to meet the needs of every child in his or her class. As a community, we do, and we can. So again, RTI is that framework that says if we're all working together and we're all bringing our parts, then we can probably be much more effective in helping and assisting all students, right? We all have our own professional knowledge that we can bring to the table. So usually with RTI, we always say, you know what, if we have if we want to ask the right questions, we'll get the right answers. So in RTI, the idea is, again, this is something that I think every good teacher does every single day and every single year. The very first thing is you say, who are my students? What do they need to learn? So you break down, okay, who are they? Who do I have? What do they need to learn, right? Then you think about what do they like? What are their talents? What are their skills that they're coming in with? Right? What don't they like? What's difficult for them? What skills do certain students in my class seem to be lacking? Right? And for a lot of the kids that we work with, what did they forget over the summer, right, in order to even know where we need to start with them? So we ask that question every single year. It's just good teaching pedagogy. Why are some of those kids struggling? I think all teachers ask themselves that. Why do I have certain kids? Why do they seem to be lacking some skills? So even though I'm a really good teacher and I'm doing a really good job, why do I have some students that are still struggling, right? And what the estimates suggest is any one of you will have 20% of your class at any given time struggling to a certain degree with some of the things that you're teaching. And again, why are they struggling, and is there some predictability to that? Right? Can we predict why they're having those difficulties? And again, you're going to have some that are much more complex. And then if we do something and we start to put the differentiated instruction, we start to change some of the things that we're doing with those students, then we always ask, did it work? Right? Is what I'm doing working for that student? And is there another way to teach them? So if I have some of those kids who aren't making those gains that I think that they should be, are there some other ways for me to approach them? It's all good teaching pedagogy, and quite honestly, again, it's all about that RTI framework. So RTI, or response to intervention, is basically just a systematic, intentional way of asking those questions for all students. Okay, so again, it's not this, what I think a lot of people thought it was when you first heard the term. RTI does support schools' improvement in two ways. It does help schools focus on continuous improvement in areas like reading and math, by identifying those students who are struggling and trying to assist them early to kind of develop those skills and work through those skills. For people like myself and say Lindsay, who's a psychologist, it does often help us also with identification, because one of the things that we're always looking for when we're going to do a diagnosis of learning disability is, have they been receiving some level of intervention to try and support them? And if they're not responding to that intervention, then it does help Lindsay and I say, okay, you know what, the chances are that this is a learning disability because we're putting things in place and they're just not responding to those things that we think that they should be responding to. So we use it as an eligibility determination as well. Why is RTI important? Well, we do know, again, because research tells us that 20 to 30% of children are going to have trouble learning to read. So right off the bat, I've shown you that out before. 20 to 30% are going to have trouble learning to read. There is some research in Canada and the United States that suggests that by the time you get to the end of grade 4, about 36% of grade 4 students don't present with the required reading skills that we would expect for grade 4. Okay, so almost a third. And again, the other thing is, too many students are being identified with a communication learning disability. So again, if we don't assess them early and catch them early and do something, there are many kids who are going to go on to develop a learning disability who wouldn't have went to that if they had received the right assessments and the right intervention at the right time, right? So for example, some of the research that we know has looked at going into, and one of my friends is a psychologist in Michigan, they did some really nice RTI stuff. They went into schools that had LD rates of 30% identification, and basically put in some very systematic programs, and they got them down to about 10%, which is, again, what we would expect in terms of reading disability identification, right? So we have to look, because there are way too many kids being identified than there should be. The other things to consider about RTI is that it can be used in areas of early intervention, and it's specifically good in reading, math, and behavior. Reading and math is because reading and math have a very large skill basis to it, so there's a lot of skills that go into being good at reading and math. RTI works really good for reading and math because RTI addresses skills, right? It assesses the skills and then helps direct you to the interventions that would therefore be important to develop those skills. So RTI isn't as good for other things like understanding large concepts. However, for skill-based things like reading and math, it's very good in those areas. So what are the principles, or what's that essential ingredients of an RTI framework? The first one, shared responsibility. I kind of already noted that we basically say everyone's responsible for the achievement of all students. So we're going to collaborate, we're supporting each other. The other thing is RTI is a framework. It's not a program. And I think that's the other thing. When a lot of people heard RTI many years ago, they thought it was this program. So I've got to implement another program. It's not a program, it's a framework. And again, I always argue again, it's no different than good teacher pedagogy that you're doing every single day. It just puts it in a framework where we ensure that we ask and go through the questions in a systematic way to ensure that we're meeting the needs of all students within the school. The other thing is, because it's a framework and not a program, RTI as a framework and what would be needed in one building and how you would respond to the students in one building may be very different than it is at another school. Okay? So when we did some RTI things a number of years ago for the Ontario Psychological Association project, one of the schools we worked in was Amherstburg. What we found was that about 25 to 30% of kids at Amherstburg were having trouble learning to read. Perfect numbers, right? They were behind, they weren't matching those benchmarks. When we went to Brock, we were at 50 to 55% of kids in Brock were not meeting those benchmarks when we did the assessment. What we did in Amherstburg was very different than what we ended up having to do in Brock, right? So the framework is still there, but what you do could be very different across schools based on what the needs of the school are. So it is school need driven, not a program that you put in place because it's a framework. RTI always has early intervention, so we had that brought up, that it's always about assessing early and intervening early, trying to catch those kids who are off track. It's problem-solving based, so we're going to focus on how do we solve these issues instead of saying that there's something wrong with the student and only focus on student deficits. If we focus on student deficits, we don't go very far. If we do a problem-solving approach, the outcomes are much better. And again, it's usually used school-wide. And what happens in RTI is you're using school-wide and grade-wide data to try and improve the instructional aspects of the classroom as well. And that goes into your school planning as well. So those are kind of the 5 key principles of RTI. So if we look at what's the essential infrastructure of RTI, typically it has multi-tiers of continuums of support. We talk about here typically 3, but there are some models that talk up to, or frameworks that talk up to 5 levels of tiers. An essential infrastructure of RTI is universal screening or progress monitoring for slow responders. So we have to do some kind of assessment to identify who the kids who are responding slowly are, and then we have to keep monitoring them to see if they're making changes. The monitoring part is important because if we put in place an intervention and we're running that intervention for 2 or 3 months, and then we decide to assess again 2 or 3 months later and the child hasn't moved at all, what have we done? We've wasted 2 to 3 months of key intervention time. And again, think about those numbers I gave you earlier. Grade 1, not reading at the end of grade 1, 80 to 85% you're not going to read at grade level, and by the time you get to the end of grade 3, it's about 95%. So we don't want to waste intervention time. So that's why that progress monitoring is so important. It is problem-solving based, so again, we're going to implement it at grade level, so for the whole classroom instruction, for the grade, within the class, for small groups, for individual students. All the interventions that we put in place are always research-based. These are interventions that we know work. These are instructional strategies that we know work through research. We're using things that are scientifically proven to work. We're not using things that, you know what, I read it on the internet 2 weeks ago on some site that I found that I can't find anymore, and this is what it says I should do. And every RTI, the other essential infrastructure of RTI is always professional ongoing development. Continuing to get knowledge and work together and collaborate. So later on, I'm going to, basically if you think about it, we've done a lot with professional development, and we've done a lot with teams in schools kind of getting together and doing some of that as well. So it's key, professional development is key. So my friend who works in the States, her big thing is this. She always says, you know what, and her experience has been when people hear about RTI, they automatically relate it to DIBELS. And many of you in this room will remember DIBELS, okay? And she'll always say, RTI is not spelled DIBELS for a reason. Because the screening and progress monitoring that DIBELS provides is only one of the ingredients. There are still 4 other ingredients. And DIBELS is just a tool. There are multiple other tools that could be used in place of DIBELS that would do the exact same thing. Okay? The other part that I add for our board is, she says why RTI is not spelled DIBELS, and I add, and it doesn't come in a red box. Okay? So many of you remember a number of years ago you got those plastic things, and they were red boxes that had all of these things that you could use to help struggling readers. Some of you are looking at me with blank faces and you've never seen the red boxes. I think some of you probably do know what the red boxes I'm talking about are. But again, those red boxes aren't RTI. Those red boxes are part of a tool that can be used in the intervention ingredient of RTI, right? And again, those were just a sample of possible intervention materials. There are hundreds of intervention materials that are out there. So again, RTI is not spelled DIBELS, and it doesn't come in a red box. Those are framework parts, but they're just tools within the framework. So typically when we look at RTI, we know that if we do really good classroom instruction, about 80% of kids in general all they will require to develop the skills is regular good classroom instruction. We know that 15% of those kids will need good classroom instruction, but they're going to need more support. They're going to need small groups. They're going to need more assistance to develop those skills. And about 5% of the kids are going to really struggle, and they're going to probably need much more individualized programs. For us, the way we think about it as psychologists is it's often that tier 3, that 5% of students who will ultimately may end up being identified under IPRC and then at some point being placed in a SIR room or having to receive, if they're not in a SIR room, a more individualized program within their regular classroom with support of all the other professionals that are in the building. Okay. It's important also to realize, what does RTI look like? And this graph, what it tries to show you is, in a picture form, is that in the general instruction regular classroom, we want to identify those students and know who they are. Once we've identified who those struggling students are, we typically are going to move them to a tier which involves some type of small group instruction. I just said some type of small group instruction. I didn't say where it was, who was offering it, who was delivering it, but it's some type of small group instruction. If that student goes to that and 6 weeks later they've responded and they're back where they should be, then that student goes back into the general instruction. If we're a couple months in and they haven't done they're not they're not making the progress we want in the small group, then they would often go through a more intensive. So we'd have to figure out, how do we increase the intensity? How do we increase the individuality of the program? And if they respond, then they go back into the general. So one of the things we're going to see is that RTI has to be very flexible. Children get the support when they need it, and when they've mastered what they need to, then they move back to the general education. You should never be in an RTI group forever. Right? You should never be in that group forever. So what's the purpose of assessment, and how are those assessments relevant to that RTI framework? So really, when we're in an RTI framework, we have to ask ourselves within the classroom, are all the kids learning? Who's progressing satisfactorily towards those benchmarks? Who's not likely to achieve those benchmarks? okay? So if any of you are familiar with DIBELS, and if we go back to that time for a little bit, when you did the very first DIBELS, if you were a grade 1 teacher, you maybe had a lot of students who were green. But then you did that second DIBELS assessment period, which was shortly after Christmas, and all of a sudden a bunch of kids who were green went to yellow or red. And I remember the panic that we had when people did that. What you need to know about framework in terms of benchmarks is if a child is green or has met a benchmark according to the manual of the tool that we're using, assessment tool we're using, it typically only means that they have a 75% chance of reaching the next benchmark. It doesn't mean that it's a 100% lock that if they have this benchmark, they're going to automatically get the next benchmark. It's about 75% chance. So you're going to have 25% of green kids or who have met the benchmark who are then going to go yellow or red the next time you assess them. If they are yellow, it goes to 50-50. There's only a 50% chance that they will meet green or match the benchmark, 50% chance they won't. If they are red, it goes to about 25-75. It's only about a 25% chance they'll hit the next benchmark. It's a 75% chance that they won't, okay? Assessment also allows us to assess the big ideas and concepts, right? So how much do they have those securely in place? Assessment in a classroom also allows us to see how fast or slowly are the groups of kids all together learning. And if I make instructional changes within my classroom, can I accelerate the growth of those students, right? So assessment can be at a classroom level. We can also use RTI for a number of other different purposes. So we certainly use it for outcome, for screening, for progress monitoring, right? We use RTI typically, especially in the reading area, because most of the tools that have been used to help us identify the reading area really do look at those big areas. It looks at phonological awareness. It looks at alphabetic principle. It looks at fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. So the tools are there for you to do that. And it also allows us to look at different levels. We can look at our grade level, we can look at an individual classroom, we can look at a small group, and we can look at an individual. So the assessment power is spread out across multiple areas. The other thing is that when we want to look at kind of a very comprehensive reading program, we basically do have to have screening, we have to have ongoing progress monitoring, and for some of the kids that are struggling, we have to have some kind of diagnostic testing as well, okay? But again, none of this by themselves is the total answer. So assessment is only, again, if we use tools like DIBELS or any other tool that we could come up with, many of you have our experience with PALS, right? It's a tool. It provides you some answers, but your knowledge of the student is important. Other reports that you've read about the student are important. Tests that you've developed, things that you've done with them, all of that has to go together. So RTI doesn't say, put total faith in the assessment tools that we suggest you use. The assessment tool is still only one part of the assessment, and you as a teacher play an extremely large. Just your professional knowledge and your professional gut is as much sometimes as in that as well in terms of you assessing and knowing that student. We do the screening because we have to pick up who are those kids that are behind, who are the kids that are most at risk at not getting the skills. But again, here's the key. You can screen all you want, but if you don't use the screening at any point to actually differentiate instruction, the screening is not of any value anyways, okay? We also have to use it for progress monitoring. Again, we can't assume that just because a student has made a benchmark level that they're going to stay there, and just because we put an intervention in place that it's going to work. Right? We have to continue to monitor that, right? And research is clear. There's a thing called teacher bias, and teacher bias says that anytime a teacher puts an intervention in place for a student, and if you ask them subjectively, how's the intervention going, they will always tell you it's going really well. But that's our bias for most of the things we do. When we do something and we put something in place, we almost always have the bias that it's doing well, right? But we don't know unless we get some level of objective data to support the subjective data. So that's why that progress monitoring is important, and it should be happening every few weeks as well. In terms of intervention systems, right, we do know that in RTI framework suggests that interventions must be research verified, and they have to be implemented with fidelity. So I think that, we have lots of research verified interventions, but again, the teachers and we as the school system have to work to learn those well, so we're ensure we're putting them in place with fidelity, okay? They have to be aligned with our specific needs of the student. And this is where we kind of have a little bit of that conversation that I think is a harder conversation as teachers to have sometimes, is the idea of, you know, when we're developing reading groups and we're going to do interventions sometimes, we have kids that are very different, right? So we have those kids that, you know, to kind of go to our bird analogy, we have some kids who are the Cardinals and the Blue Jays. They're just doing wonderfully, right? They flip their bat when they hit a home run. Not a sports crowd, okay. Right? The Red Wings have not made any changes yet either, in case you need to know, Barry. They've stood pat. But those good readers, we often say, you know what, they're Blue Jays, they're Cardinals, but then all of you have what we call it the Crow group, right? The group that's really struggling. What RTI and research-verified interventions tell us is, when it comes to reading, which is a skill, that when you group students for small group for reading instruction, especially those kids who are lagging behind, the Crows have to go with the Crows, and the Blue Jays have to go with the Blue Jays, because the Crows have specific deficits, and we have to start where those deficits are and move forward, and we need the kids in the group to have the same reading difficulties. You cannot put in place 4 different kids who are having difficulty or on different levels of that chart that I showed you and expect them in that group to make progress. It has to be targeted, and the kids in that small group have to be together. Now, are there other times that we have struggling readers, the Crows and the Blue Jays together? Absolutely. If we're doing a teacher read aloud, and then you're going to discuss the book, I want all of the students together, because some of those struggling readers are going to learn so much from those other students in terms of vocabulary, the ideas that those other students are giving, the concepts and things that they're identifying for that student that they may not have thought of. Those are very important for those struggling readers to be in those groups with those other kids. You know, just like Shelley was saying, it's going to help them build vocabulary. It's going to help them with text structure, right? But for the skills, they have to be in like groups, okay? And again, it has to be monitored over time, and it has to be flexible and responsive. We should never have a child in the same group. If they've made changes, they then go to where their assistance, at what level they need. So there's always going to be kids flowing in and out. You're not going to have the same group of 4 kids all year. You should have kids flowing in and out of the different levels of groups depending on what their needs are at each time. And many kids will, when they've made the gains that they need to make, they're going back in and they're not in the groups. And then, but you know what, 3 months later, they may need to come back, right? So that's that flexibility and that responsiveness that we're looking for in an RTI model framework. Intervention should be part of the core instruction and the regular classroom practice if possible. So they're just natural things that you're doing in the classroom. And again, they have to be focused on student need, not on assigning students to a specific tier. So the tiers may look different in different schools depending on what the needs of the school are. The way that you implement an RTI framework may be very different depending on what school you are, what your resources are in the school, how many teachers you have, you know what, and how you as a school may want to approach using those resources. So it can be very, very different. Okay. Here's what we do know works. We know that we know about how learning breaks down. So especially in the area of reading, and again, like I said before, because we can then pretty much predict where those breakdowns are going to be, then we can intervene and we can use the regular classroom program and those small groups to intervene. Again, we know that the research-verified interventions work, right? But they have to be very much targeted on very specific goals, and then it has to be like kids that are in those groups. Small group instruction is extremely important. We know that that works in terms of an intervention. And again, just the idea that students have guaranteed access to those interventions, again, is one of the key parts of an RTI framework. If they have the ability to access those, and all students have the ability to access the tiers of support that they need when they need it, then we know that that works significantly and it moves children into the areas that they need to be moved into. Just some helpful systems and structure ideas. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in sessions, the next set of sessions. If you can have a master schedule so you can find a way in your classroom to build in intervention time for all students to access, that's really important. Remember those flexible groupings. Again, staff professional development has to be ongoing, and you know what, we're lucky in this board that we're doing this right now. And then professional learning communities. I think within a school, taking the expertise that you have within your school and working together as a professional learning community goes a long ways. I think that's been something our board has also focused on in trying to develop those professional learning communities within schools. I would just add that there are sometimes when you think about professional learning communities, you think about the people who are in the schools 5 days a week. There is also advantages to thinking about the social workers, speech and language pathologists, psychologists, any other professional, because they will come in with a piece of knowledge that can be helpful in those professional learning communities as well. So the larger the professional learning community is, the more areas of expertise we have around the table, and therefore typically the better problem solving that we can do. Okay?